Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. I'm really not sure how to start this video. I was going to do a fun little gag mocking the 6500 XT before completely tearing into it, but this thing is just so bad, it's really spoilt the mood for me. So I'll cut right to it. This, in my opinion, is the worst GPU release I can remember, and I've been doing this job for over 2 decades. Maybe there was something worse along the way, but I can't remember anything being this bad. Sure, there was stuff like the DDR4 version of the GT 1030 that could certainly be considered far worse, as that was a disgusting anti-consumer act by Nvidia. But as far as new product releases go, I can't think of anything worse. The Radeon RX 6500 XT is just so bad, I don't even know where to begin. I know I'm kind of doing this review in reverse. This stuff's probably meant to be included in the conclusion, but yeah, damn, I'm just so floored by AMD here. And there's no one reason for why the 6500 XT is terrible. It's a combination of reasons, just bad decisions that all point to AMD just taking advantage of the current market and therefore abusing gamers in the process. In a nutshell, the 107mm squared Navi 24 die that the 6500 XT is based on was originally intended for use in laptops and probably wouldn't have made its way to desktop, and if it did, it certainly wouldn't have at the $200 price point. Think more like RX 550 replacement. But due to the current market conditions, AMD's decided to, for lack of a better word, cash in. And they're doing so with a product that makes no sense on the desktop, at least at this price point. And worse still, in most ways, worse than products that have occupied this price point for half a decade. The key issues with the 6500 XT are this. It's limited to just PCI Express x4 bandwidth, which is a major issue, and you'll see why shortly. It also comes with just 4GB of VRAM, and there's no 8GB option. Hardware encoding isn't supported, so you can't use Relive to capture gameplay, which for me personally is a complete deal breaker. And because it was intended for use in laptops, just 2 display outputs are supported. And all this for a $200 US MSRP, which will probably end up being more like $300 US at best, after the initial run of MSRP cards disappear, of course, which is likely to happen shortly after release by people who probably didn't watch my review. Now, AMD claims that these sacrifices needed to be made in order to get the die size as small as they have, which has allowed them to hit the $200 price point, which we believe is a bit of a lie. And really, even if it isn't, it's just hard to justify releasing a product that is technically worse, actually it's just all round worse, than products that you've had out in the market for 5 years now, as well as products from your competitor. Anyway, at this point I should probably just show you how underwhelming the gaming performance is, which, as I've said, is just one of the many problems with this abomination. For testing, I'm using our Ryzen 9 5950X GPU test system, and yes, I know no one is going to pair a budget graphics card with this CPU, but of course that isn't the point. We're testing GPU performance and therefore wish to avoid introducing a CPU bottleneck which would skew the data. But needless to say, the results would be the same for these lower-end GPUs with a Ryzen 5 5600X or any of the new locked Alder Lake CPUs. As for the data itself, everything is 100% fresh for this video. I've spent the last few weeks updating our mid-range GPU results, and much of the testing has been done using medium quality settings, or at least settings that make sense for a given title. Also, please note that the 6500 XT has been tested using both PCI Express 4.0 and 3.0 on the same motherboard. I've simply toggled between the 2 specifications in the BIOS. Finally, I've tested at 1080p and 1440p, but for this video, I'm going to focus on the more relevant 1080p results, while the 1440p graphs will be made available to Patreon and Floatplane members. Okay, let's get into it. Starting with the Assassin's Creed Valhalla results using the medium quality preset, we find that with PCI Express 4.0, the 6500 XT is basically only able to match the 5500 XT and the 4GB version of the 5500 XT at that. So a super disappointing result right off the bat. It was also only able to roughly match the RX 590, which is basically an RX 580, which is an overclocked RX 480, a product released 5 years ago now. But it gets much worse for the 6500 XT because when we switch to PCIe 3.0, which is really what the vast majority of 6500 XT owners are going to be using, the average frame rate dropped by 9%, and more critically, the 1% lows dropped by 14%. That's really a huge performance reduction, And you'll find as we look at more games, that reduction in PCIe bandwidth often hurts 1% low performance the most. It's also worth noting that all Turing-based GPUs use PCIe 3.0 times 16. So the 1650 Super, for example, has been tested using the 3.0 spec. And this means when installed in a 3.0 system, it's up to 16% faster than the 6500 XT in this game. Even if we go off the average frame rate, the 1650 Super was still 7% faster, and it was released for $160 US back in November of 2019. The Shadow of the Tomb Raider results paint quite the picture. Unlike Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which was tested using the medium quality preset, Shadow of the Tomb Raider has been tested using the highest quality preset, as this is quite an old game now. Also, for most models, performance is about the same. For example, the GTX 1650 averaged 65 FPS in our Assassin's Creed Valhalla test, and we're looking at 67 FPS on average in Shadow of the Tomb Raider. There's also only a 2 FPS difference for the 6500 XT when using PCI Express 4.0. However, once again, the issue for the 6500 XT is PCI Express 3.0, and in this game, it's a really big issue. Again, the GTX 1650 Super is a PCIe 3.0 GPU, but it has full x16 bandwidth, which does help to reduce and even remove any performance bottlenecks. But with the 6500 XT limited to x4 bandwidth, performance falls off a cliff in the PCIe 3.0 mode, dropping by up to 50%, and this is seen when looking at the 1% lows. The average frame rate though, that also fell by 28%, and saw the 6500 XT go from 65 FPS on average to just 47 FPS. It also meant, although it was able to match the 5500 XT when using PCIe 4.0, when installed in a PCIe 3.0 system, you're looking at more base model GTX 1650 performance, so worse than that of the RX 570. And for those of you that were around when I reviewed the GTX 1650, you'll know how I felt about that product. The Watch Dogs Legion performance using the medium quality preset is, again, rather underwhelming. We're looking at GTX 1650 Super Light performance, making it a smidgen faster than the 5500 XT and RX 590. And this time, PCIe 3.0 only dropped performance by 8%, or 13% for the 1% lows, and while that's far less than what was seen in Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I'd still consider this disastrous for an already struggling product. In the PCIe 3.0 mode, the 6500 XT was slower than the RX 590 and only a few frames faster than the 4GB 5500 XT. So another very unfortunate result for the new GPU AMD is trying to convince you is worth $200 US, and probably a lot more than that. Okay, so quick disclaimer here, I've had to come back and re-update my Rainbow Six Siege testing. I've spent a lot of time trying to work out what is going on here. Now, I have tested this game using Vulkan and not DirectX 11, and I've done so for quite a long time now as it is typically the superior API. However, after noticing the abnormally terrible 6500 XT results, I tried again with DirectX 11 and found performance using PCIe 4.0 improved performance by 14% to 133 FPS on average, and I believe this is because when exceeding the memory buffer, DirectX 11 handles this a bit better, or for whatever reason, the card does work better when exceeding the memory buffer using the DirectX 11 API. Now, interestingly, that's still much lower than what you're going to see from some other reviewers who will probably have the 6500 XT up around 170 to 180 FPS using the ultra quality preset. And the reason for this is the HD texture pack, which I've always tested with installed. So this isn't something unusual I'm doing for this testing. All previous Rainbow Six Siege testing has been done with the HD texture pack installed. And this is really interesting as it highlights the PCIe bandwidth / VRAM capacity issue with the 6500 XT. And the reason I've always used the HD texture pack is because Rainbow Six Siege is an old game that was released 7 years ago now. Yeah, it has had some updates, but fundamentally it isn't a cutting-edge title, and you can see that here with GPUs such as the RX 590 pushing over 180 FPS using the maximum quality preset with the HD texture pack installed. And it's also well worth noting that other 4GB graphics cards are just fine. The 6500 XT isn't though. Here it's gimped by PCIe bandwidth even in the PCIe 4.0 x 4 mode. When compared to the GTX 1650 Super, which is a 4GB graphics card, again, there are 4GB graphics cards here which are just fine, so this, in my opinion, is not an unrealistic test condition, but the 1650 Super does use PCIe 3.0 x 16, and therefore the 6500 XT was an incredible 27% slower. But more incredible, and I certainly mean incredible in a bad way, but even more incredible is the fact that when using PCIe 3.0, the 6500 XT was 46% slower than the GTX 1650 Super, and wait for it, 53% slower than the RX 590. Hell, it was even slower than the RX 570. What a disgraceful result for the 6500 XT. This is an unacceptable result, even with the HD texture pack. And look, you can argue that the ultra quality settings with the HD textures isn't realistic for a 4GB graphics card, but again, the 1650 Super made out just fine, as did the RX 570. The 6500 XT is just a bad product with too many weaknesses to count. Next we have F1 2021, and boy does the 6500 XT stink in this one. I should note that we're using the high quality preset here, and no form of ray tracing is enabled. Our previous PCIe bandwidth testing also revealed that F1 2021 isn't particularly bandwidth sensitive, so I'm not entirely sure why the 6500 XT performs so poorly here. I did rerun this test multiple times, but I got the same data each time. So either this is a driver related issue or just a weakness of the Navi 24 design, but as it stands, the 6500 XT is well down on where you'd expect it to be, typically seen hovering around the same level of performance as the 5500 XT in previous tests. Now, as bad as the PCIe 4.0 performance is, switching to PCIe 3.0 just makes it a lot worse, dropping frame rates by almost 30% to the same level as the GTX 1050 Ti. Ouch. The 6500 XT is able to just edge out the 5500 XT in Horizon Zero Dawn using the Favor quality preset, delivering 7% more performance than the 4GB 5500 XT. So, not amazing, but certainly one of the better results. It was also much faster than the RX 590, offering around 20% more performance in this example, though there is a but here. Using PCIe 3.0 crippled the 6500 XT, dropping the average frame rate to 53 FPS, meaning it was 36% faster when using PCIe 4.0. So for those of you using a PCIe 3.0 system, which again will be most looking at buying a budget GPU, the new 6500 XT is going to be no faster than the old RX 570 in this game. Moving on to Far Cry 6, with the medium quality settings, we find the 6500 XT is delivering 5500 XT-like performance, though when using PCIe 4.0 it is able to mimic the performance of the 8GB model, so I suppose that's a decent result. It also matched the RX 590 and is therefore delivering 580-like performance. That said, when used in the PCIe 3.0 mode, the average frame rate dropped by 17% and the 1% low by 23%, so now we're much closer to the RX 570. Again, the 6500 XT, it doesn't look half bad in our PCIe 4.0 system, but switching to the 3.0 spec really hurts performance to the point where I imagine it's getting hard to justify this product even when near the $200 US MSRP. Doom Eternal's another interesting game to test with, as this one tries to avoid exceeding the memory buffer limit by limiting the level of quality settings you can use. So here I'm using the ultra quality preset, but for the 4GB models, I've had to reduce the texture quality from ultra to medium before the game would allow me to apply the preset. So at 1080p, with the ultra quality preset and ultra quality textures, the game uses up to 5.6GB of VRAM in our test scene, and this is what we've used for cards with 6GB or more VRAM. Then for the 4GB models, we've dropped the texture pool size to medium, and this reduces the figure to roughly 4GB. And this means, despite tweaking the settings for the 6500 XT, it's still 27% slower than the RX 590, which has an 8GB VRAM buffer and is running higher quality textures. Granted, the game's still perfectly playable with 98 FPS on average, but that level of performance, or really much better, has been achievable on a budget for years now. But again, this is how the 6500 XT performs when using PCIe 4.0, and then switching to 3.0, again, just completely cripples it, dropping the average frame rate by 53% down to just 46 FPS on average. An embarrassment for AMD to say the least, and worse than the old RX 570. It's shameful, really. Resident Evil Village uses very little VRAM at 1080p with the balance preset. We're talking about a peak of just 3.4GB in our test, so this is really a best case result for the 6500 XT in a modern game. That said, the overall performance is a joke, only matching the old RX 570 with 75 FPS, making it 18% slower than the RX 590 and 17% slower than the 5500 XT. Even worse is the fact that the 6500 XT was 17% faster using PCIe 4.0 opposed to 3.0, with the previous bus spec dropping the average frame rate to just 64 FPS, less than what you'll receive from the GTX 1650, a GPU I once thought to be an embarrassment in this segment. AMD's somehow gone and managed to make Nvidia look good 2 years later. Death Stranding also uses very little VRAM with the default quality preset and isn't particularly bus bandwidth sensitive. So here we have our best result for the new 6500 XT, and it's not exactly breathtaking. Yes, the performance overall is very good for a single player game, but it's also no faster than the RX 590 and GTX 1650 Super. Hitman 3 is also another good showing for the 6500 XT, at least relative to what we've shown so far. Again, it's only roughly on par with the RX 590 and just 5% faster than the underwhelming 5500 XT. But like I said, compared to what we've seen so far, this is actually very good. That said, when using the PCI Express 3.0 specification, performance did drop by 9%, and now the 6500 XT is slower than the 5500 XT and just 5% faster than the 1650 Super, so yeah, another poor result here. And last up we have Cyberpunk 2077, and well, it's really just more of the same. Best case using PCIe 4.0, the 6500 XT is almost on par with the 5500 XT, and is therefore a little slower than the RX 590. Then switching to PCIe 3.0 dropped performance by 17%, and now we're looking at just 39 FPS on average, while the RX 590 is good for 50 FPS. So using PCIe 3.0, the 6500 XT is an RX 570 in Cyberpunk 2077. But hey, maybe the power consumption has something special for us. After all, this is the first 6nm GPU, and AMD bragged to us how small and power efficient they've managed to make the 6500 XT. Unfortunately, while this is the only real positive aspect of this product, it's not exactly class-leading either, as the GTX 1650 Super not only uses less power, but it's also faster. Compared to the old RX 590, I guess it's impressive, saving 130 watts when gaming, so that's pretty good, but I'll be honest, I'd take the 590 every day of the week. Okay, so here's a look at the 12-game average data, and here you can see the reason why I'd take the RX 590 every day of the week. We see when using PCIe 4.0 that the 6500 XT was still 9% slower than the RX 590 across the dozen games tested at 1080p. That comparison really does speak volumes about the 6500 XT, but it's the PCIe 3.0 result that cements it as the worst GPU we can recall reviewing, at least in recent history. Using PCIe 3.0, the 6500 XT was 29% slower than the RX 590 and 25% slower than the GTX 1650 Super, or another way to put it, the RX 590 was 40% faster and the GTX 1650 Super 34% faster. That's the same margin you'll find when going from the $480 6700 XT to the $1,000 6900 XT. So given that anything over $200 US for this level of performance is absurd, even in today's market, let me show you why. I've got a lot of cost per frame graphs to go over here, but let's start in fantasy land because, you know, it's fun to pretend. Yes, I'm talking about the MSRP. If all GPUs, past and present, were still available today at their original MSRP, this is how they'd stack up. The GTX 1650 Super would be the value king, followed by the 4GB 5500 XT. The 6500 XT in its PCIe 4.0 mode would be below average, offering similar value to the old RX 570, and worse than the terrible GTX 1650, so that's less than ideal. Then when re-evaluated using the PCIe 3.0 performance numbers, the 6500 XT ends up being the worst value GPU to be released in the mid-range to low-end segment in the last 5 years, so that's just great news. But what if we look at the typical eBay sale prices and go with a more realistic $300 US asking price for the 6500 XT? If the PCIe 4.0 performance was the same performance you'd see when using PCIe 3.0, then in today's market, it wouldn't be terrible, assuming you only want dual monitor support and don't require hardware encoding. If you want either of those features, then you might as well just get the 1650 Super, given that this is the performance that particular card offers on a PCIe 3.0 system, or perhaps better still, get the much cheaper RX 570, which can be regularly had for $220 US. That's an $80 saving on a card that supports full PCIe x16 bandwidth, hardware encoding, and triple monitor support, and some cards even support more monitors. Still, as far as cost per frame goes, the 6500 XT isn't bad at $300, providing you can get at or very near to the PCIe 4.0 performance. It's just not great, but it might be useful for some. And again, the problem really is the PCIe 3.0 performance, which kills the value of the 6500 XT, making it by far one of the worst graphics cards available today in the $300 to $700 price range. Okay, so we started in pricing fantasy land with the MSRPs, and then we quickly jumped to the harsh reality of pricing on eBay. But what about wishful thinking for just the 6500 XT? So basically, fantasy land again, but for this one product. What if the 6500 XT was available for $200 and in good numbers, while everything else was priced where it currently is? This is about the only way the 6500 XT makes sense, and even then, if you're not using PCIe 4.0, it's not a given that you go for AMD's laptop GPU on a PCIe card. The PCIe 4.0 performance makes it by far the best value option, again assuming that you don't need stuff like hardware encoding. But for PCIe 3.0 users, even at $200 US, I feel it's still a tough sell, as you'll get a similar level of value from the 4GB 5500 XT while receiving twice the PCIe bandwidth, hardware encoding, and triple monitor support. Or for similar money, you can just snag a second-hand RX 570, and again, it has none of the shortcomings the 6500 XT suffers from. As a side note to the testing just seen, it is worth noting that AMD's own benchmark numbers for the 6500 XT are of course based on PCIe 4.0 performance, but they also have SAM enabled. And that's AMD's branding for the PCIe Resizable BAR feature. So I've gone back and tested Assassin's Creed Valhalla with SAM enabled, as this game sees between a 15 to 20% performance gain with high-end GPUs such as the RX 6800, 6800 XT, and 6900 XT. In the case of the 6500 XT, it looks as though SAM is significantly less effective, as here we're only seeing a 5% performance bump in the PCIe 4.0 mode, which I suppose is helpful, though sadly there is no performance gain to be had when using PCIe 3.0, at least in this example. So SAM doesn't help alleviate the PCIe 3.0 bottleneck. Before wrapping up the testing, I decided to take a look at preset scaling with the 6500 XT using both PCI Express 4.0 and 3.0. Starting with the Rainbow Six Siege data using the Vulkan API, we find that it's really only the Ultra quality preset which cripples the PCIe 3.0 configuration, which I suppose is to be expected, at least in this game. So what this means is if you're an esports type gamer using competitive settings, then the PCIe bandwidth weakness of the 6500 XT is likely going to be far less of an issue. Now I've also run these same tests using DirectX 11, and interestingly, when memory limited, the 6500 XT does make out much better, seen when looking at the ultra and very high quality data, while the high and medium data is similar to what we saw when testing with Vulkan. Watch Dogs Legion is interesting because previously this game was tested using the medium quality preset, where we found PCIe 4.0 to be 9% faster. But even if we use the lowest quality preset the game has to offer, that margin doesn't really change, and in fact it grew here to 11%. So that means there's going to be at least a 10% advantage for PCIe 4.0 over 3.0 in this title with the 6500 XT. It's also worth noting that if you're more of a single-player campaign-type gamer who only targets, say, 40 to 60 FPS and has a priority on visual quality rather than high FPS, the 6500 XT really isn't going to be for you, at least if you're limited to PCIe 3.0. Here, the very high-quality preset ran 29% faster using PCIe 4.0 with 44 FPS at 1080p, opposed to just 34 FPS using PCIe 3.0. F1 2021 didn't play nearly as well on the 6500 XT when limited to PCIe 3.0. We saw 47% stronger performance with the ultra-high preset when using PCIe 4.0, and again, those of you prioritizing visuals over frame rates won't be best served by the 6500 XT. Then, we see with the high-quality preset, which we've already shown previously when testing F1 2021, that the PCIe 4.0 configuration was 41% faster. But here we're also seeing it's 37% faster using medium, and quite shockingly still 24% faster when using low. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a game that ran terribly using PCIe 3.0 relative to what we saw with 4.0, though I was using the highest quality preset. This saw 4.0 deliver 38% greater performance, and that margin was heavily reduced to 18% with the high quality preset, then 9% with medium, and 6% with low. Still, my issue here is that the game looks and runs great using the highest and high quality presets with PCIe 4.0. So dropping so much performance when using PCIe 3.0 simply isn't acceptable. You've waited a long time for AMD to release a budget RDNA 2 GPU, and you've waited even longer to replace your RX 460, 470, 480, 560, 570, or maybe 580. And this is what you're now faced with, the 6500 XT with an asking price of $200 US, which will likely end up being $300 plus. And you know what though? I could have gotten on board with the whole it only has 4GB of VRAM so miners won't buy it argument if the rest of the GPU wasn't so heavily cut down. And sure, avoiding the PCIe 3.0 performance hit, or at least significantly reducing it, will be relatively easy in most games, just lower texture quality. But is that really the point? I know some people are going to make this argument, so I'm just going to head it off by saying why. Why would you compromise on the most important visual quality setting to head off an unnecessary performance hit when used in a PCIe 3.0 system? And of course, with the 6500 XT, you're forced into doing just that. But with the GTX 1650 Super, for example, you don't have to, despite that it also only features just 4GB of VRAM, and this is because it supports the full PCIe x16 bandwidth. As a result, it was able to deliver perfectly playable performance in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p using the highest quality preset. We saw 67 FPS on average. So, while I know that some will claim the testing to be unrealistic or unreasonable, it's really not. Even the 6500 XT itself was good for 65 FPS in our Shadow of the Tomb Raider test using PCIe 4.0. You can't drop nearly 30% of the original performance when moving to a PCIe specification that can't even saturate the RTX 3090 and blame anything but the graphics card. An even better example would be a more modern game like Watch Dogs Legion, which was tested using the medium quality preset, and that sets texture quality to its lowest possible value. Yet even here, 1% lows dropped by 13% when using PCIe 3.0, and on a budget GPU already struggling to maintain over 60 FPS at all times, that performance hit will certainly be noticed. The fact is, you can't compromise on both VRAM capacity and PCIe bandwidth. To a degree, you can get away with handicapping one or the other, but both is just disastrous for performance. It also creates a situation where the 6500 XT is overly sensitive to exceeding the VRAM buffer, even by a little bit, whereas products such as the GTX 1650 Super have a lot more leeway. But of course, as I mentioned at the start of this video, the PCIe x4 bandwidth limitation is just one of the major problems with the 6500 XT. Another big problem with this product is the fact that encoding isn't supported. So AMD's version of Shadowplay, known as Relive, can't be used with the 6500 XT. But if you had an old RX 470 even, I was going to say 480, but even a 470, you could use a feature like Relive. So for me, this is a complete deal breaker, as I use this feature not only when gaming with my friends, but I also use it even for work. I don't care if I'm spending $2,000 or $200 on a GPU, I want hardware encoding, and frankly, I feel GPU hardware encoding is even more critical on low-end systems that simply don't have the CPU resources to spare. You're also limited to just 2 display outputs, which again could be a deal breaker for some people. But the point being, this isn't a limitation of much older products, such as the RX 480, for example. The 6500 XT also forgoes AV1 decode support, making it fairly ordinary for use in a modern home theater PC. AV1 content is already pretty widespread today, so retiring this graphics card into a home theater PC in a few years' time won't be an option for most, hurting its value even more, and this is a feature you do get on the more expensive RDNA 2 GPUs. So, assuming that you're happy to sacrifice the features just mentioned, and also assuming that you can achieve the PCIe 4.0 performance shown in this video using perhaps PCIe 3.0 by heavily reducing texture quality and likely other quality settings, what is the Radeon RX 6500 XT worth? In my opinion, it's a hard pass at $300. You'd be far better off buying a used graphics card such as the GTX 1650 Super, 5500 XT, or the 4GB versions of the RX 570/580. Given the GTX 1650 Super is a PCIe 3.0x16 product, it's going to be a much safer bet for the vast majority of gamers. The 6500 XT, in my opinion, really only starts to become a viable option at $200. And frankly, for me to buy it, it would need to be no more than $200 US. And yes, I am aware of the current market situation. Frankly, I'd rather spend $100 more on the GTX 1650 Super to get the features I actually need and use. I'd also probably be gaming on a PCIe 3.0 system if I was in the market for such a product, making the GTX 1650 Super the obvious choice. So that's it, $200 or bust for the 6500 XT, and as prices for parts such as the RX 580 and GTX 1650 Super start to fall, I foresee rough times ahead for AMD's new budget offering. There's not much more to say really. The 6500 XT is extremely disappointing, and its future now hinges entirely on pricing and availability. Paying a hefty premium for this one is just simply out of the question. I can't help but feel AMD could have done so much better here, but it looks as though the Radeon brand is destined to flounder. It's a real shame given how competitive they've become at the high end of this generation, though even there, they've completely failed to capitalize due to the supply woes. And that is going to do it for yet another depressing day one GPU review. I'm sorry guys, but the 6500 XT, well, it is what it is. So if you appreciate this honest take on this not so impressive product, then please do give the video a like. You can subscribe for more content. I don't think I'll be doing any 6500 XT AIB card reviews. I've had quite a few companies reach out. Their cards were late, but they were wondering if I was doing any roundups. I think at this point in time, given how disappointed I am with this product, I'm going to pass on those AIB card reviews. But of course, we will watch pricing and see how things play out over the next few weeks, and Tim will do his GPU pricing updates monthly. So anyway, like I said, like, subscribe. We also have Patreon and Floatplane if you want to get early access to content, if you want to see behind the scenes stuff, Q&As, live streams that Tim and myself do, and get access to our Discord server for Hardware Unboxed community members. But if not, perfectly fine. I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.